plenty of mobile growth strategies are still built on broken journeys and incomplete data, and it's costing brands big time. Branch fixes that. It's your AI-powered MMP that unifies your links, measurement, and user experience across every channel to successfully acquire, retain, and engage your app users without wasting spend. Learn more at branch.io. And while you're there, check out Branch's AI Search and Discovery Report, covering insights from more than 300 marketing, growth, and digital leaders on how they're responding to the rise of AI search.
The problem is that the distinction needs to be drawn between the competence of the economists and the correctness of their analysis.
Hello and welcome to the Mobile Dev Memo podcast. I'm your host, Eric Seufert, and I'm joined today by Olivia Kory, who I think is coming back for the third appearance. Is that right?
Third time. I'm honored.
Well, I appreciate you coming on because this was kind of short notice. I've been meaning to have you back on, and the perfect opportunity presented itself when yesterday we all learned that an investment syndicate consortium comprised of Meta, Google, Unity, and Moloco have invested $1 billion into AppsFlyer. And given, your attachment to the measurement space, I thought you'd have a lot of fascinating insight on that news. So welcome back.
Thank you. And before we started recording, I mentioned this to you, but when the news hit, I was thinking to myself, like, man, I wish I could talk to Eric about this. So this is perfect timing and excited to be here. But you didn't see this coming, which I saw you posted that you didn't see this one coming, which is surprising. Usually you're like 10 steps ahead of the industry here.
No. So full disclosure, I'm an advisor at Unity. They definitely kept me away from that news, which,
Smart.
Good for them. Not that I would reveal anything, but I had no idea. And it was, as I said, news to me. Maybe before we dive right in, for those who didn't hear your previous episodes, and most people probably follow you on Twitter and elsewhere, but could you just introduce yourself?
Sure. So Olivia Kory, I am the Chief Marketing and Strategy Officer at Haus. I think the reason why you and I get along so well is I usually kind of just talk about my brand side experience when I'm introducing myself, but I have a pretty deep background also in the ad tech space. And I've kind of seen this industry from a few different angles. So I actually started my career agency side at Publicis. And then I moved over to ad tech to a programmatic DSP called TubeMogul. And their big pitch also in 2013, 14 was independence, neutrality. They were going up against the likes of big tech and Google and Meta. Trade Desk ended up winning out, but they had a pretty successful acquisition to Adobe. So I saw the ad tech ecosystem from that angle. And then I moved over to the brand side, spent a few years at Netflix. I like to say Netflix is where I got my MBA in incrementality testing and really learned from the best. And then I moved on to Quibi, which is where I got the mobile app experience. And then to Sonos, where I got the e-commerce experience, and then was doing incrementality testing at Sonos and saw the impact it was having on the organization and joined my founder, Zach, at Haus in 2022. Haus was kind of like born from the ashes of iOS 14.5 and built really the business with him. Been doing it now for 4 years, and we have a couple hundred customers. So we've seen a lot. We have a lot of battle scars from this movement, from attribution, if you will, over to incrementality. So you'll find me maybe a little more tired and maybe perhaps burned out than I have been in past appearances, but transformation isn't easy.
Well, and also congrats on the promotion.
Thank you.
Yeah, I remember that was like 3 months ago or something. I remember you announced that.
It's pretty recent. It was a few weeks ago, but I'm excited. I figured if I'm going to be giving advice to CMOs all day, I need to prove myself.
Well deserved. Okay, so maybe I just want to get your kind of high level general thoughts on that investment. So what was your initial reaction? How did you interpret that news?
Yeah, I mean, this was just fascinating. And I bet you can imagine from where I sit, it's kind of a novel way to think about M&A in this space, I think. So if you have to rewind a little bit, let's rewind maybe 5-6 years to the AppLovin-Adjust acquisition. And I think, we experience this all the time. We talk about this in the context of Haus quite a bit, is like independence, neutrality, objectivity is our biggest asset. It is why brands work with us. It is so core to our mission, to our value prop. We're really nothing without it. And there are even moments where we really put the customers at the center of everything we do. It's very core to our mission. But you can think of an example like ad credits, for example, where if a customer is signing up with us, we have this thing called the partner benefits program, where a platform, an ad platform, will provide our brands, our partners, with ad credits to test a new channel. And even in that moment, it starts to become gray area of like, oh, are we out kind of beyond our skis in terms of our involvement here in this partnership between the ad platforms and the brands? And so we really try to be very thoughtful around objectivity. And so you have this acquisition of Adjust by AppLovin, and I want to talk to you about this. Like, I don't think anybody would say that is a success. And I don't know if we'll ever really know why. It could have been a clash of cultures. It could have been for reasons separate from the neutrality piece. But I think I often point to that as like kind of an example of what you don't want to happen, where this thing that was kind of prided on being independent ends up in the hands of the platform that is perhaps grading their own homework. And so I don't think anybody would point to that and say that that was successful. So then here we have this news yesterday of, and this is why I think it's novel, of, I mean, AppsFlyer by all accounts is doing well. I think they feel ubiquitous to me in this industry. It feels like they've emerged as the clear winner. Attribution, we can talk about this, is still table stakes in this space. And so they're doing well. They want liquidity. And instead of selling to one entity, they sell to a consortium. And thus not, it's the case that no single kind of entity here can bias their platform, their results in a way where they're putting their thumb on the scale. And in that way, I just feel like it's a win-win. AppsFlyer gets the liquidity, the team gets liquidity, and Meta, Google, Unity, Moloco, like they get to keep a good thing going in terms of this like independent arbiter of truth. And so we loved it. The team here was really applauding the acquisition, but I think perception is reality. The open question is like, will advertisers perceive them as neutral with this deal? And I think that's the open question that I've been wrestling with is, how do brands feel about it? And I haven't really talked to them yet. You see this all the time with things like Meta's conversion lift product or Google's open source Meridian. Like brands, even if it's built with the best of intention, they just don't want to trust the platform who's grading their own homework. So I think big open question around how brands feel about this. But I think it's I think it's certainly interesting and unique in the way they've approached it. And I saw your coverage, and I want to hear your thoughts. I think we also just need to talk about the why and the AppLovin of it all, and whether this was just to keep it out of AppLovin's hands.
Yeah. So I don't think it was to keep it out of AppLovin's hands. My sense is that Adjust has been for sale for some time. I don't believe that AppLovin sees that much strategic value in that asset anymore. So like going back, right? So I wrote, why did AppLovin buy Adjust in February 2021? And, my argument was, okay, it's financial engineering because AppLovin had these kind of like locked in service contracts, these long-term contracts. It just did, there was a revenue boost. The app ecosystem component of it, because AppLovin was still aggregating games at that point in time. And, they had the IDFVs, and there's maybe ways you could line IDFVs up across publishers if you use the IP address, and then conversion value management, which was going to be the new thing everyone thought in the wake of SKAdNetwork, 2.0 being launched with ATT, right? And I think none of that really ended up being the case. What they said was that, look, they've got a great sales team and they can upsell their clients on our ad network. Their ad network was still growing. They're growing a lot now, but their ad network was kind of like an underdog at the time. And, that made some sense. My sense was that they saw ATT as just an opportune time to get good valuations on assets. And they just bought, and a bunch of people took this approach, right? Digital Turbine, for instance, like Zynga, they just bought stuff because like this, we're going to get good prices and we'll find a way to stitch it all together. And my sense is Adjust probably never really materialized as like a meaningful part of a strategy. Obviously, AppLovin is like a totally different company now than it was then. I mean, it's not an underdog anymore. It's the dominant app install network. In many cases, I'll go in and look at what companies are spending money on, and it's number 2 behind Google. Might even be number 1 in a lot of cases, ahead of both Google and Facebook. And so I do know that my belief is, and I've talked to people that worked at the company, and they said they really did keep a firewall between those two entities. Like they had, one guy showed me he's got an adjust Slack and there's no AppLovin Slack. And like they had no access, my understanding, and this is what I've been told, I believe this to be true. They had no sort of like mutual backend access, right? So, okay, so they kept those two things separate. I don't think that they would want to buy AppsFlyer. My sense is it was a defensive maneuver against AppLovin by those companies because AppLovin is dominant in mobile gaming now. But I think also the existing investors wanted out, right? I actually advised the 2017 Series D, I think it was, or Series C, Goldman invested. And I said, look, I think Apple is going to deprecate the IDFA. I don't know if an attribution company is a great investment right now. I wrote my piece, The Coming War Between Apple and Facebook in 2017. That deal was 2017. I remember believing at the time, that's the whole thesis of that coming war with Apple and Facebook. The post was that I think Apple's going to deprecate the IDFA. I think that's a good way to stave off these companies from sort of like usurping the direct customer relationship and building these big ad businesses and cutting Apple out of not just the ads piece, but the commission piece and also control of the App Store. And so that's what I told, the investors at the time. And so like my sense is like, this is just core infrastructure now. And the existing investors wanted out. The IPO fell through. The acquisition by PE fell through. If they really wanted out, they would have probably forced a sale, maybe to somebody that you just wouldn't want controlling that critical infrastructure, right? And there are a number of companies that probably fit that description. And so my sense is that's what it was. It's like, look, attribution, like you said, attribution has been it's been a very durable practice, but, and we'll talk about this, measurement has evolved beyond just attribution. No one thinks of measurement as attribution anymore, which that used to be the case with app advertising. And so it's just part of a toolkit. And for, even like, a lot of gaming advertisers, it's part of a toolkit. And so I think like, these companies might have said, look, we require stability and predictability with the largest single attribution platform. It's worth it to us to put money into it to drive the valuation up beyond what any company would reasonably pay. And so that just sort of protects that interest. My sense is, and I don't have any inside information about this, I don't have any information whatsoever. My sense is the vast majority of that billion went to buying out the existing investors so that now they've got a lot more patient investors that are behind them that are not going to try to force a sale anytime soon. I don't know how much of that hit the balance sheet and will be used for R&D. My sense is this was just exchanging these investors that wanted a payout. Again, that 2017 investment, they did a 2017 investment and 2020 investment. 2017 was Goldman, and then the 2020 was the Series D with, I'm blanking on who led the Series D, but it was big. It was 210 million. Okay, well, that's 6 years ago, and the 2017 was 9 years ago. They want a return. They want money. And so I think that's probably what that was. It's just swapping out these PE funds that are going to want to sell and they need to return with much more patient investors who see a lot of strategic value in having this be independent and neutral and, not sort of influenced by a buyer that might not have those same interests.
Yeah. Okay. I have a few questions for you on that. Number one, like whose hands does this get into in terms of the wrong hands? Like who are Google and Meta and Unity and Moloco nervous about? If not AppLovin, of course, one of them, but where else does this end up where it hurts them in terms of the ad networks?
I mean, there's kind of any, so you could imagine like a ByteDance. Now there's issues there. I mean, I don't know that they can necessarily pull that off, but you can imagine an Amazon. You can imagine, so I think about who Google, so there's different sets of competing or competition fears, right? Like Google and Meta have one. And Google and Meta, that may have been more about creating a stable base that sits in opposition to Adjust. But, you could there's gaming companies that could afford, let's say that, because they were trying to sell at 1.9, apparently and this is just reported on by Calcalist, the PE funds thought they should pull back on that valuation, I think because of the AI stuff. And I guess the existing investors wouldn't accept that. But think about okay, 2 billion is pretty big. But, you could think about an OpenAI. You could think about any of these companies that directly compete that will directly compete with Google and Meta for advertising dollars. And I mean, yeah, I would put, ByteDance, Amazon, OpenAI with its advertising ambitions. And that's $2 billion to them is chump change, right? They spend 150 on TVPN. But there's any number of these and then you see kind of now, and we'll talk about this, I hope, the sort of consolidation with CTV, having this kind of be a cross-channel measurement, system makes a lot of sense, right? So I think there's just from the Google and Meta's perspective, there's a lot of defensive value there. And then from a different set of competitors. And then from like Unity and Moloco, I think you could make the case that you wouldn't want private equity owning that and doing like another roll up.
Yep.
Right. I mean, so now imagine, a lot of these assets are cheap now. And so you see private equity saying, hey, wait a second, we can buy a measurement company. We can roll a couple of other things into there, other types of advertising surfaces, maybe even some apps. And then, take another swing at like the sort of circa 2020 AppLovin approach, which was owning a big content portfolio plus the measurement. And then, having all of that data from everybody else. Like, so I think and so that's like the Moloco, maybe the Moloco Unity perspective. But I think there's also and also to your point, AppLovin owns the second largest attribution platform. The first largest, we should ensure that it's just neutral and quote unquote independent.
Yep. I think you're right when you talk about attribution as infrastructure at this point. But the question I've always wondered, and I'll ask you while I have the expert, is like, if attribution is infra, if it's more or less commoditized at this point, like, why don't brands do this in-house? Like, this was one of the things that I couldn't believe when I joined Quibi, when we went and we learned about the ecosystem. Like, nobody would ever build this in-house. Everybody has an MMP. It is just not something that but whereas in other industries, like a lot of brands have their own in-house attribution model. So like, if it feels like infra, why don't more people build versus buy?
That's such a good question. And I'm working on a long form, like, just solo podcast that is a history of the MMP program. Because you have to, because of Facebook. It's a cottage industry that Facebook established with the MMP program. So going back, Facebook called this the PMP program, product marketing partner or something like that.
Yeah. It wasn't FMP, right? There's FMP.
It was FMP, Facebook marketing partner. That's right. It's FMP, Facebook marketing partner program, then became the MMP program. But if you wanted to attribute Facebook installs, you had to use an MMP, and they got to decide who got to do that. It was a total cottage industry. So like the thing is, I remember King had its own attribution. When I was at a company called Wooga, we built our own attribution system, and we did attribution for everything but Facebook. And if you wanted to attribute Facebook, you had to go through an MMP, and they didn't give any exceptions. And so, the tech is kind of, I don't want to say commodity. I think that's like, that minimizes the complexity of it, I think, but you could build it if you had, you could build it and maintain it. And we did, right? And Wooga wasn't like a huge company. The only reason you had to go through an official, a company in the MMP program was that was the only way you got access to the API to do Facebook attribution. That was it. So they kept this whole segment, essentially, they prevented real competition from emerging. And so like these people got to kind of charge, I think, prices that were not consistent with like the quality of the service, right? So, and you talk about like the Apple tax. I think there's an MMP tax. I mean, it's pretty expensive. And now they a lot of the MMPs offer, ancillary services, and like a lot of companies basically use MMPs for like core analytics now. And so that's why there's like a lot of resiliency built in. But that's why you have to have an MMP, because otherwise you can't attribute Facebook app installs. And if Facebook is, your number one, number two, and maybe number three, you need to be able to do that. And so you kind of build everything around that.
Yeah, we'll talk about this in terms of, we talked about like how are MMPs trending over time, and it still feels ubiquitous. And I guess my question was just why, and that helps answer it. It was propagated by Facebook.
Mobile game developers no longer need to pay up to 30% in major app store fees. With Xsolo Web Shop, you can create a direct storefront, cut fees down to as low as 5%, and keep players engaged with bundles, rewards, and analytics. Start today at xsolla.com. That's XSOLLA.com, or use the link in the episode show notes.
What is your perception of how customers and how the market perceived the AppLovin-Adjust deal? Like, do you think that part of the reason that hasn't been a very strategic acquisition is because the value of the asset was diminished by it belonging to AppLovin in the first place?
Well, first of all, I love that you're flipping the table here. Just asking me the questions. Yeah, it a little bit, but not to the degree that you might have expected. Like this was kind of like when in my consulting days. So I worked with a lot of studios the gaming studios at the time, and there people, they explore the prospect of switching, but the switching costs with MMPs are high. It's not a trivial task to swap out MMPs. And there was a question of like, well, AppLovin says they're not accessing that data. Again, I believe that they weren't, in the main. And so like it was, what's the real risk here? And just given the lift, given the sort of like engineering resources and the distraction of swapping out MMPs, it doesn't make sense. Like I would say that the number of defectors, call them defectors from the Adjust platform, was a lot lower as a result of the acquisition than the number of people that stopped working with AppsFlyer when they launched their gaming studio, like when they actually officially launched Lion Studios. That there was more, I want to say there were more sort of like scaled gaming companies that said, we're not going to work with AppLovin anymore after they announced their own gaming studio initiative. Then there were people that switched off of Adjust to other MMPs, at least in the short term. Now, I do think that you saw AppsFlyer eclipse Adjust in terms of like, feature set after the acquisition, just because they're sort of a portfolio company essentially of AppLovin. That's how they're treated. And so I don't think that they invested as much into like R&D as AppsFlyer was. And so you did see more of like a trickle of people away from Adjust. But I think they've got a pretty stable customer base. I don't know that it's like dwindled down to something immaterial to the company. So, there wasn't though that like sort of an immediate exodus that you might have expected.
Yep. I think, well, that bodes well for this deal for AppsFlyer in terms of, and I mean, this is minority stake, no influence, and a consortium of platforms. So we'll see. But I think that to know that there wasn't a mass exodus in the hands of AppLovin makes me feel pretty confident that brands and advertisers are not going to see this as problematic, which I think is exciting because I think it's the right thing for the industry.
Yeah, and just one more thing on this, because you keep saying brands, but we're talking about app advertisers, and
Yeah.
for an app advertiser's like mentality about all of this is very different than like a traditional brand, and so it's kind of like, and even with the gaming studio stuff, it's like, okay, well, AppLovin is now a serious competitor of ours when they are publishing games, but what are we going to do? Like, where are we going to go if we cut AppLovin out of our mix? Like, what we're just basically cutting off a stream of revenue. And so I think that's kind of how they think about it. So they can be just much more calculated in those kinds of decisions. But okay, talk to me about what were you seeing in terms of app install attribution before this? Like what were the trends, and what kind of insights do you think app advertisers were most interested in, and how had their measurement stacks been changing and adapting to support that?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. You can get back to asking me questions now, Eric. I won't ask you anymore. Attribution trends. So these MMPs are still very much ubiquitous. And I think one of the last times I was on here, we were talking about this evolution in terms of measurement from attribution to incrementality. And that has very much happened, and it's happening, it's underway. But we still see that there is a role here and that attribution has value. And the reason why is, despite it being clicky, right? Like it's clicky, like it picks up these lower funnel channels. It gives you signal on lower funnel. It really misses impact in terms of upper funnel, view-based channels, YouTube, CTV, OpenAI, ChatGPT ads. Like it's definitely biased, but these advertisers need two things. They need daily signal and they need ad level granularity. And we have seen time and time again, that is like non-negotiable for them. And so what we're starting to see is like incrementality adjusted attribution, in that we understand the bias. Like we understand the ways in which attribution is biased. We can adjust for that bias, get to an incrementality kind of adjustment, but still give them what they want, which is the daily ad level granularity. Like you said, you just made a joke about like, these are app advertisers. And I think this ecosystem even better than I do in terms of like, they're in Meta ads all day. They're in Google all day. They're clicking around all day long. Like to expect that they're just going to be able to like hand wave and say like, no, we'll get you that incrementality readout at the end of the month is just unrealistic. And so that's what we're seeing in terms of this movement of like, we're actually bringing the best of these experiments and causal data into the kind of dashboard, if you will, MCP. They can pull it into their system, but into the view that they're used to looking at like hourly, if not daily.
And so was that a function of like that, having that incremental lens on it? Was that a function of exploring new channels, or was that a function of kind of like leveling up and probably evolving from the last click kind of mentality that dominated, I would say, app install advertising from like 20, call it 12, when the practice really took off to like, let's say 2019 or 2020, even going into ATT. Was it an evolution, or was it just, well, actually we need more channels and then we can't use last click on those, so we need a new approach?
Yep. I think it's both. So the bias in terms of correlation and click-based attribution, I think, is well understood at this point. You run like a UAC standard campaign in Google and it looks extremely efficient. And then you run a UAC video campaign that's delivering primarily on YouTube and other video channels. And the video campaign looks horribly inefficient. The standard campaign looks great. You run an incrementality test and it's actually the reverse. I think it's, you see that these things normalize when you're adjusting for incrementality. And I think budgets are adjusting accordingly. Like you're seeing shifts out of the typical kind of lower funnel search. ASA, good example of just a channel that looks amazing on a last click basis in the MMP that, tends to be less incremental. So that's happening. And I think that's been underway for a while. And then you have the persona who just wants to expand into new channels. There's this constant belief, again, whether rational or not, I think there's some truth to it, that Meta and Google are kind of perpetually delivering to like circling the drain in terms of delivering to your existing customers and the people who are going to come in anyway. Like their algorithm is so good at finding intent that it tends to be non-incremental. And there is just this like belief across the industry that this is what's happening with their models. And so when folks sign up with Haus, their number one use case is like, I want to introduce my brand, my app to new audiences. I want to go break out of this bubble and go deliver to new customers, to new users. And the way in which they see themselves doing that is both signal engineering in Meta and Google, pointing it to kind of like shallower kind of signals, but also expanding into new channels. Enter CTV, YouTube, most kind of video-based advertising channels are seeing a huge rise in popularity. And then the like LLM kind of ad formats of the world as well. And what's interesting here is they all come in really excited about this. And then something like the tariffs happen, or there's a war in Iran and oil prices are going up, and like the appetite to actually see through that channel expansion and to like have the patience to actually go crack those channels tends to be a little bit lower than perhaps it was when they started the year. So I'm not seeing like the rise in spend match like the rise in excitement, if you will, around a platform or a channel like CTV, especially in the mobile app space. Like I'm not seeing CTV budgets taking like 20% share of wallet, even though, again, you might think that based on the headlines. Like every time times get tough in terms of macro economy or pacing behind on goals, they end up back in Meta and Google.
Yeah, like flight to quality, but flight to perceived quality. And like on the basis of, the measurement, which I think most people would agree is not very sophisticated or robust if you're just doing last click, right? But to your point, that's how they consume it. And it's like consumption defines the framework in a lot of ways. It's like, because, well, if the CFO looks at this dashboard, then whatever we replace it with has to fit in the dashboard. And that's not as easy to do with like pure play incrementality or whatever other approach, MMM.
Yeah. What we are seeing though is the rise of the longer experiment. If the hypothesis is that these channels like a Vibe, which I'm sure we'll talk about, or universal ads is introducing your brand to new audiences, which is again what they want, what they sign up wanting, then you need a longer test that plays out over a longer time horizon. So, one of the big learnings that we've had over the past maybe year or so at Haus is like a 2-week test it's just not enough time to even see anything on a CTV channel. And what we're seeing is like a lot of that lift is coming in the back half of a 4 or a 6-week experiment. And that is a reality though, that you do have to contend with, of like these different channels have different payback windows, and what is the value of a dollar that you get today versus a dollar that you get back tomorrow. So that it is one thing that we've learned, is that you need a longer test, but that also comes with its own drawbacks.
Well, yeah, right. So good luck going to a CFO and saying, look, we can't rigorously make any determination about this unless we spend $500K over 3 months. You're probably not going to get approved, right?
Yeah. we're not very patient. Marketers, we're not very patient. And so you really do and we have so many examples. We just published some data on this of most of that lift on CTV is coming in the back half, which is like, if you cut it at 3-4 weeks, you are missing all the value. So,
right. And the interaction effects, I think people don't appreciate that. It's like, yeah, it has value when paired with these other channels. And so, that's a big piece of it. And a lot of MMMs don't even, they deliberately don't even capture interaction effects. And so you're just going to miss that completely. And, it's like, even like, okay, we do a longer test, but at a very tiny budget, you're going to run into the same issues. It's going to get absorbed by the bigger channels. You're not going to really be able to distinguish. You have to, like, guys, I don't need to tell you this, but you have to really deliberately and thoughtfully engineer these tests.
Yep.
And people just don't, or they'll have it'll be messy. And, all of this in marketing it suffers from collinearity anyway. And so it's a very challenging. Well, it's the reason why, Haus exists. Like, that's the whole point, right? It's to get that marketing expertise applied to your campaigns. I do want to talk about CTV, and I do want to talk about, the Vibe acquisition that I guess got announced today. But before we get there, I think another takeaway from this investment into AppsFlyer is that, these companies clearly believe that SKAdNetwork / ad attribution kit is going nowhere. If they thought no, this will evolve over time and this will become something meaningful, they probably wouldn't do this. But no one does. This is dead, right? I mean, I chose violence one day. I was on a flight, and whatever it was, like last week, and I was like, "Are you kidding me, Apple? So you're just done even giving us updates? Like, you pushed companies into adopting SKAdNetwork wholesale. You convinced them this was the future. People spent millions of dollars. I was attached to projects where probably millions of dollars were spent in a single company adapting to SKAdNetwork. And you're not even going to give an update anymore. You're not even going to tell us what's new, because nothing's new, because you don't care about it. You just decided one day that you were going to force everybody to adopt this new methodology under threat of basically being, call it deplatformed, having your company be killed. Because if you get your app removed from the App Store because you were deemed to be non-compliant, you're talking about a potentially existential threat. You're not even following through. What, this is 5 years later. You're not even following through with updates anymore. This is dead. This was just so disrespectful and so inconsiderate. And so callous to the entire mobile app ecosystem that supports you. And you can't even deign to give an update anymore about what the roadmap is or any new features, if there have been any, that have been added to ad attribution kit. Are you kidding me? So it's dead, right? It's dead.
Wow. Well said. We've got to clip that. We've got to clip that. I think about this all the time. It is still infuriating. That they did it also all under the guise of privacy, with the billboards everywhere in 2020. And I don't understand what the end game was, because my thought at the time when they did it is okay, they're getting ready to launch a big ads business of their own. This is the only logical explanation for what they're doing, is that they want to win in the ads business, but they're not really doing that. They're not really trying to build a much bigger ads business. At least it doesn't seem like that to me. Did they just not realize what they were getting into here? Did they not realize how hard it was going to be? And does that bode well for the AppsFlyers of the world if this is just kind of painful and complicated? Strategically, it makes no sense. I feel like someone at Apple should have to explain themselves.
Well, I would hope they would have had to do that in some kind of congressional testimony or something, but that never happened. And it just seems like they've abandoned it. They're not even giving updates anymore. It's not even what's new. So they've just left people with this completely dysfunctional, incomplete framework that it's useless. It's effectively useless. And walked away from it, as if that was going to solve any problems or fill this void that they created, that they sort of conjured up. And you can make, and I don't want to get into the ATT stuff because that's old. That dead horse has been mutilated. But it was just the fact that they can't even go through the motions of pretending like they're continuing to invest in it. Like they have completely moved on.
Yep. They've completely abandoned it. There's no explanation for that other than they just didn't realize what they were doing at the time. It wasn't well thought out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I also think there wasn't a consensus internally, and there was just a lot of people that made the case that this wouldn't have that big of an impact. Maybe the experience from ITP was informed of that decision, because ITP didn't really change that much because Safari wasn't the dominant browser and people found workarounds. But yeah, maybe they just underestimated the impact. You know those channels your colleagues keep bragging about? The ones getting all the credit? Yeah, they might be doing squat. Attribution makes every channel look like a hero, even when it's a zero. Incremental tells you who's actually doing the work. It's like a lie detector for your marketing budget. Start using Incremental today. Get your demo at incremental.com. That's INCRMNTAL.com. Mention that you came through the Mobile Dev Memo podcast for a special 15% discount for the first 6 months. Okay, I want to talk about CTV because that's a really interesting. You mentioned that you see the app advertisers aren't shifting meaningful budget, but is it trending up into CTV? Is there more experimental budget going there? How do app advertisers, from your perspective, view CTV?
Yep. So I think what the Vibes of the world and the Universal Ads of the world have done really well is, we talked about this earlier, good luck telling the CFO you're going to invest more money and for a longer period of time, and you won't be able to show returns for 6 months. That is a very difficult conversation to have. And so where I think Vibe's winning is they've positioned TV as a performance channel. And so you're seeing the rise, in Universal Ads has the same messaging in market of run this like your meta ads, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable to a performance outcome. And I think that's working really well now. And just to say, because I've experienced this with finance teams as well, is everybody talks about brand marketing and wanting to invest in building the brand, but the reality is they only care about brand insofar as it's driving downstream outcomes. And so you eventually have to tie the brand spend to an outcome, or it's going to be the first thing on the chopping block. It's going to be the first thing that gets cut. And so I think Vibe's doing a really good job of that. Is they're similar to AppLovin when they launched the e-com pilot, is they have leaned into third-party measurement quite a bit. They're funding a lot of house tests where they'll put credits up and they'll make it really low risk, very easy to test. Universal Ads the same way. And thus they can the marketers and the teams can kind of justify it as a performance channel. Now, that being said, I do like to be realistic about what's possible here. We have some data now on how quickly you see the effects of a Meta, how quickly you see the effects of an AppLovin. It takes a little bit longer to play out in terms of these effects. You're introducing your brand, your app, whatever it is, to often new audiences. They're going to need more frequency. They're going to need more time. And so we did publish this data, but for a channel like a CTV, you've just got to run a longer test, and you have to be realistic about expectations there. And you have to make sure you can protect that long enough to see the effects. And that's the thing that I think the teams that we work with struggle with, of letting the bet play out for long enough to actually make it an always on channel that is, there alongside the Metas, the Googles, the AppLovins of the world.
Yeah. And I think, it's that timeline is important to think about too, because I think, no serious person would say brand marketing can't possibly improve my commercial prospects. Brand marketing can't possibly contribute to my marketing success. No serious person would say that. But you do hear a lot of people saying well, brand marketing will absolutely contribute to your commercial success. And it's well, that's just as absurd of a statement. You have to test it. You don't know that. And then the other thing is okay, sure. But I think it can. So I believe that it can possibly, I believe that brand marketing can, upper funnel, it's called upper funnel marketing, can possibly improve my sort of the impact of my marketing on my business. On what timeline? Because it's also got to do it on a timeline that I care about, right? And so if it's in 5 years after $100 million of expenditure, well, okay, maybe I'll leave some money on the table then and not pursue it. I understand that I'm sort of under investing by that standard, or from that perspective, but Like it's just impossible. Like the time value of money and like the prioritization and like the return on other things is just greater, right? And so it's like I get that brand marketing could. I get maybe if I even say I bet I've done this sort of analysis or I've looked at comps and I bet brand marketing probably will improve the power of my marketing overall. But like given the timeline of return on that investment and the sort of like the hurdle rate in terms of how much I have to spend to see that return, there are other things I can put that money into that would have just like higher ROI. And so I'll do those things. It's not like, first of all, it shouldn't be driven by like religion or like kind of like, just blind faith. You need to test it. But second, you need to kind of just determine like, well, when I take into account the time value of money and I take into account the ROI on, when I rank that expenditure against other places where I can put that money, is it going to be the best possible use of that money? Yeah. And so I think like that's an important exercise to go through.
Yep. The conversation I'm having a lot of right now is this comes up every year. Every year, there's this big like, hey, we need to crack TV. And then they'll find reasons not to test. This actually happens more in the world of linear TV than CTV, because CTV is pretty easy to test and it's pretty easy to get going. But in linear, it's a little bit harder to run a geo test. And so every year they'll look at doing a geo test. They won't run it. They might try it for a few months. They won't be able to see any discernible impact to the business. You mentioned linearity. It's a multi-linearity problem where they're lighting up TV right around the time that their business kind of seasonality tends to ramp up. And then nobody has any idea what it delivered to the business. And then they turn it off and then they have the same conversation again next year. And so I've been pushing really hard of like, I know this is going to take longer and it's going to be more expensive than you would like, but you need an answer to this question. And so that's what we've been seeing a lot of. But I'm totally with you. We talk about this all the time, is like these delayed impacts you're speaking of, like it feels very imaginary in a lot of ways. And we're trying to help these brands actually assign some data to it. And I think the research on this, the like existing kind of data on long-term effects is like not good. There's not much of it. And so we're finding that we're just having to go and run these tests ourselves and collect the research.
When you approach this, it's important to have like some kind of measurement framework. I think a lot of the other people that advocate for like, well, brand advertising is a necessary, it's a critical, it's an indispensable part of the toolkit. Oftentimes then they'll say something like, but it can't be measured. And like, well, that's not really helpful. Like I had Carl Mela on the podcast, and what I loved about his framework is like, no, he's measurement first. It's measurement first framework. It's like, here's how you measure that. I'm not just making a claim that like you must be building a brand. I'm like, this is the approach you should take to measuring it. And I like also they rooted that in a lot of kind of like financial metrics, because then, that's an easier sell to, your finance team or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And we're like, we are working with some very large brands, but like for the most part, we're not talking to P&G here, like a big CPG conglomerate. We're talking to a Series B, Series C startup that's like fighting every day to survive. Right. And it's like the brand conversation is just a very different one at that stage. And like, again, you can look at these like shallower proxy metrics, you can look at them, but like you need to tie them to downstream sales. And I think that's part of the reason we've been doing well as a business is like, we speak and we report on the language that the finance teams understand. And the board is like, we're speaking in the same language in terms of these metrics.
Well, I also think that's what's important about and what's differentiating and meaningful about the approach taken by Universal Ads. It's not so much that it's measurable from a click standpoint, because it isn't. It's about they let you be flexible with the budget, with the targeting. And because if you don't have that, there's no way to do real experiment-based measurement. There just isn't. And if you set the bar for a campaign to be like, oh, well, it's $1 million minimum, then well, forget it. Like you're never going to get, a smaller company investing in that. They need that. The sort of like money at risk has to be much lower than that.
Yep. Vibe has made it incredibly easy to do business with them. They are so accommodating. They're so easy to work with. And there's something to be said for that versus like a trade desk on the other hand with minimums and just a lot of barriers to entry. So that team just has been hustling like crazy. I'm really happy for them.
All right, I want to talk about you. So you recently published a report on AppLovin. They just today went GA with the self-serve. So maybe it was, I don't know if it was a response to the AppsFlyer news to try to suck all the oxygen in the room, but I think it's been on the schedule for a long time. Tell me about the report. What did you find? What are the primary findings of the report?
You know that the conversation around AppLovin has been very polarizing for a very long time. I started off very skeptical, just with a background in programmatic open web, really hard to like differentiate in that space. And there's like just not a whole lot of great inventory. So I myself personally started off skeptical. We started testing. We looked at, 15 months as part of this most recent analysis. I'd say last year throughout 2025, we were very encouraged by results and we were posting them along the way. But this meta-analysis looks at 15 months of data. And what we consistently see is that app is hanging in as like a strong number 2 or number 3 channel in the mix. We looked at how it's comparing to the other experiments running at the same time. And we saw efficiency was 11% better than the average of other channels that those same brands tested. So it's looking good. It hits hard. AppLovin works quickly. And we know, we just talked about this, that can be a feature. That can be a really good feature, very easy in terms of working it into your models and your payback cycles and whatnot. So it works fast. And it is also primarily driving like D2C. So it lowers the measurement complexity because most of the impact is happening on digital channels versus like offline on an Amazon or a retail. I'd say those are the key stats. The big one that we looked at, the big question was, is it hanging in as these brands scale the channel? And the data there is it's a more mixed story. So, I think this is probably similar to a lot of new channel stories where you see really good efficiency. And then the next question is, how is that efficiency hang in there when you start scaling the channel? And what we looked at was, how is AppLovin performing versus the typical test run at the same time to control for seasonality? And AppLovin was beating the typical test between like 60 and 85% of the time in 2025. So just consistently winning in terms of performance. But in 2026, that number has come down and it's settled to closer to like a coin flip, which means only half the time is it beating the average of other tests and other channels being run at the same time. And so that suggests that like early edge that they have is normalizing as brands scale up spend. But we're seeing like AppLovin share of wallet increase very clearly. We have data, I think it's 5% in January to over 8% share of wallet in May. So it does seem like brands are leaning in. Obviously, this data is mixed. It's not great. Like it's not perfect in terms of the data on how it's scaling, but they're commanding a pretty respectable share of wallet in terms of 8%. We don't see anyone else in terms of the secondary platforms growing at that clip. That's
an incredible share, 8%. I mean, that's impressive in the e-com space in the course of 15 months.
That's API spend we can track. So it's like the core digital channels. It wouldn't include TV as an example. It's the Meta, Google, AppLovin, Snap, TikTok, Pinterest.
Wow. Okay. By the way, I just occurred to me, you're not chatting to me from the beach in Cannes. I don't see a turquoise water in the background here.
Yes. Then I wouldn't be here with you. This is what I live for, Eric. So I'm better behind the desk.
So I just saw the most, what I think is a very sort of like appropriate description of Cannes from Matt Baloney. I'll just read it. Welcome back to What I'm Hearing. Thankfully not coming from the Cannes Lion ad conference. I shouldn't have to say this, but to everyone asking if I'll be at Cannes this year, Cannes is the Festival de Cannes, a prestigious global film event where talented creative people display and sell their work and look glamorous doing so. Cannes Lion is not. It's a tacky business conference for selling advertising and announcing brand partnerships populated mostly by paunchy middle managers and YouTubers. They call it an international festival of creativity, but that's just to make the suits and the media people feel better about their soulless corporate boondoggle. Enjoy the rosé.
Oh, man. I wish this Haus experience was like 10 years ago or 10 years from now where, my kids maybe are a little bit older or right. I don't. Yeah, it's just like, it's so hard. It's so hard to justify. I agree with a lot of what he said.
I hear you. Olivia, thank you for coming on the podcast with little to essentially no notice. Appreciate your insights as always. Talk to the audience about Haus. How can they learn more?
Haus.io, we just launched a lot of very ambitious new products in terms of roadmap. We've been kind of building toward this since the early days of Haus in terms of like, how do you reduce the friction from insight to action? How do we get better at operationalizing incrementality in a way where like you're actually using these tests to improve business outcomes? So our roadmap is all in pursuit of that, and would love to just talk to more folks about what we're building and get thoughts and feedback from smart people. So of course, feel free to message me. My DMs are open.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eric.